For antiwar.com, I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. And it's time to welcome back our regular guest, Dr. Gareth Porter, independent historian and journalist, writes for IPS News. That's ipsnews.net, and also writes at antiwar.com. The address there is original.antiwar.com/Porter, and I think if you just go to antiwar.com/Porter, it'll forward you on there. Welcome to the show, Gareth. How are you doing?
Thanks as always, Scott. Glad to be back.
Appreciate having you here. Now, people could tune into pretty much any radio show and find out that, okay, Obama's ordered an escalation of troops. And I guess if they're listening to right-wing radio, they can hear about how it should have been 80,000 like the Pentagon wanted or something like that. But it seems like people listening to Chaos this afternoon are lucky to actually have some real analysis of what's going on here. Especially the article I'm thinking of is how Obama himself and his political operatives have already debunked their own case for the escalation in Afghanistan. Why don't you tell us about that?
It's a fascinating backstory here that we have surrounding his speech, because I've been tracking the decision-making process in the Obama administration for weeks and weeks in anticipation of this historic moment. And, basically what happened is pretty much what I expected, that Obama caved in to the senior national security advisors surrounding him, all of whom were lined up neatly by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, Obama's choice to be held over from the Bush administration for political purposes, to get them lined up behind a compromise formula, which clearly was sold by Gates to the White House as the only possible way out of his dilemma, so that basically... Which
was not the Afghanistan war dilemma, which was his political dilemma in dealing with the generals.
Exactly. His political dilemma, which is you can't afford to put yourself on the wrong side of the generals, to be absolutely at odds with them. This was made clear, I'm sure, to Obama, as if he didn't already believe that. But at the same time, Obama has to square himself somehow to keep his Democratic Party coalition together, so he can't appear to have been completely supine, and therefore Obama has to get something out of this. And what Obama got was that clearly this is not a military mission which is aimed at destroying or eliminating the Taliban movement. He made that abundantly clear, was quite explicit, and interestingly so, that is a very limited military mission here of sort of denting the Taliban or weakening them. And on the other hand, basically McChrystal gets essentially all of the troops that he could have reasonably hoped for, given the realities of troop availability, and essentially is able to carry on his counterinsurgency war as I think pretty much he wished. So, both sides get something, but nobody's going to be happy about this, and certainly not those people who want to have a rational foreign policy.
Yeah, well, certainly not them.
but what I was coming to essentially is that in the process of trying to establish a kind of sort of a defense against the anticipated troop request for 40,000 troops, basically Obama debunked the idea that the Taliban is somehow really dependent on Al-Qaeda or is bound to be supine in the face of Al-Qaeda demands to provide a safe haven for Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, or really is really interested in continuing a global jihad campaign in cooperation with Al-Qaeda once they would be able to gain power. He basically had the message go out through his operatives in the White House to the New York Times that the Taliban is now considered not to be a sworn enemy of the United States. It is not a global jihadist outfit, but a group that's dedicated to its own Afghan interests, its national interest in Afghanistan.
You know, I know you have all kinds of great intelligence sources for a lot of your work. Has anybody, I guess it's, Phil Giraldi has said, you know, that if you ask the CIA or the State Department, they'd tell you that maybe there's 1,000 actual real terrorists in the whole world. But I wondered, has anybody told you how many Arabs, which I guess we're supposed to believe that any Arab in the northwestern region of Pakistan or that kind of border region of Afghanistan is automatically, the servant of Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Right,
and I don't know if there's any reason that anyone should believe that at all. But how many Arab Afghan, quote unquote, mujahideen types are up there anywhere? I mean, maximum number here. What are we talking about?
Probably a couple of dozen.
A couple of dozen people.
Yeah,
this is what I thought.
I mean, the people that they're talking about, the 100 or 200 that they talk about in all these reports, are in fact not Arabs. They're basically Pashtuns from across the border who are being trained, in Pakistan, and undoubtedly reflect more of a jihadist perspective on balance than the Afghan Taliban who are being recruited within the country. But the actual Arab contingent is just tiny. It's really just a few dozen.
Right. So basically, this entire mission, it might as well be based on Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program at this point.
Well, I think that is precisely right. I mean, the point really here is that that Gates and Mullen, who testified yesterday, and pronounced really a whole new set of bogus national security arguments for the war in Afghanistan, are essentially doing what the military and the Pentagon have done for foreign wars ever since the beginning of the Vietnam War, which is to make up their national security rationale out of whole cloth. They're making up something that they have absolutely no evidence for, and which I think, in fact, the intelligence community has been passing on information which directly contradicts this in no uncertain terms. And I can tell you exactly what's been passed on to officials that is completely inconsistent with those ideas. The idea being that the Taliban and Al Qaeda have a symbiotic relationship, that they're both basically dedicated to the same kind of jihadism, that the victory of one is going to redound to the success of the other, and so on and so forth. The reality that I'm quite sure that both Mullen and Gates have been informed about quite clearly, is that over the last couple of years, the Taliban has been asserting quite clearly, quite explicitly, that it does not agree with, and in fact quite vociferously opposes, the Al-Qaeda strategy of attacking the Pakistani government. After all, the Pakistani government is the Taliban's main ally. The Taliban have really depended not on Al-Qaeda, but on the Pakistani government for its support for the last several years. It has been extremely important to the Taliban, particularly in allowing them to return with such strength since 2005. And so the fundamental strategic difference between Al-Qaeda, which is supporting an all-out attack against the Pakistani government and military, and the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is opposed to that, gives the lie to this entire new set of national security rationales for the war.
Yeah, well, and I wonder about that too. I know that there have been some suicide attacks and things, and I remember...
Right, that's really the only argument that they have to support this notion of a symbiotic relationship, is the fact that there have been suicide attacks which are not characteristic of the Afghan Taliban in the past. Absolutely true.
Well, and of course, part of the story then is that there's been all this blowback for the any kind of Islamic militants, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or anybody else in Pakistan, But, you know, I wonder if some of those are bogus. You know, I saw an interview with Jeremy Scahill after his recent article on in The Nation magazine about, or at least on their website, about the CIA using Blackwater inside Pakistan. And it was Amy Goodman interviewing him, and she ran a clip of one of the Pakistan Taliban guys saying, you know, we're not doing these suicide bombings, and nobody who we know is doing these suicide bombings. We think it's the CIA and their mercenaries and whatever doing them,
yes,
you know, in order to discredit us. And, you know, that only seems, you know, it doesn't seem that kooky to me, even though it was, I mean, obviously I'm not saying you'd take that guy's word for it or anything like that, but then again, you know, it does seem stupidly counterproductive from their point of view to do suicide bombings against civilians inside Pakistan. But it does make sense if you were the CIA trying to discredit them inside Pakistan.
Yeah, at the very least, we can say this much, that those sorts of bombings, particularly, for example, a bombing of a marketplace in Peshawar, Pakistan, is not the kind of thing that the disciplined mainstream, even Pakistani Taliban movement has carried out. This is a splinter of a splinter of a splinter, if you will. It is at most a very it's an offshoot which is a very outside the normal discipline of one of these organizations, and certainly it is very suspicious. What is interesting, clearly, is that none of the Pakistani Taliban organizations take credit for this, want to have anything to do with that sort of operation. And it is characteristic, however, you have to recognize of the Taliban itself. Of the Al Qaeda itself. That is the kind of thing, of course, that.
But then again, there's only a couple of dozen of them.
That's right.
And, I mean, what does that even mean? A couple of dozen of them are doing suicide bombings like that?
Well, I mean, I think it is quite credible that you have only a tiny number of people who are carrying out suicide bombings. They obviously create much greater mayhem per person than any other type of operation, and so you don't have to have large core of recruits to carry out suicide.
Do you think that bin Laden and Zawahiri are both in Pakistan? I mean, that's what everybody seems to just say or accept. Obama certainly just asserted it.
I've always assumed that, but we don't know for sure. It's possible that they are still in the eastern, southeastern part of Afghanistan, or the eastern provinces of Afghanistan. You know, it's certainly the case. I mean, I've been studying the Pashtun provinces of Afghanistan, and what's very striking to me is that you have a huge, I mean, really vast area of Pashtun Afghanistan that stretches all the way from the western border near Herat all the way to Kunar province on the Pakistani border, and that there are some, I don't know, 7-8 million people, almost all, I mean, you know, 90 to 95% of them are Pashtun in this area. It's a contiguous area in which the Taliban and their allies have the ability to roam pretty much freely. I mean, the number of troops that the United States and NATO countries have in this truly vast land area of southern Afghanistan, all the way from west to east, that number is so small that it really does not impede the free movement of the Taliban from one end of the Taliban territory to the other. And so one has to be impressed at the wide area in which someone could hide in that part of Afghanistan. No question about it. I mean, that's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. Here's this landlocked country with no state, 8,000 miles away, or 7,000 something miles away, or something like that. And we're supposed to believe that these people are a threat to America when, you know, never mind, you know, the commission or whatever. You got James Bamford and Lawrence Wright, people like that, who've written this story. And it turns out that the guys that did 9/11, the pilots who were the core of the Hamburg cell, these guys were Egyptian graduate students in engineering school, at least some of them, in Hamburg, Germany.
Right.
And I guess, they went to Afghanistan. A few of them, Ramzi bin al-Shihab, Mohammed Atta, went to Afghanistan to say, hey, look, we want to do y'all's mission because we're that pissed off or whatever. But it wasn't Afghanistan. That was the key to anything. And any idiot can hijack a fuel truck and crash it into something. You don't have to be controlled by Pakistani tribesmen somehow to do a terrorist attack in America, and everybody knows it. It's really worse than Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program as an excuse.
It really is. I agree with you, Scott. It is the most cockamamie argument from national security ever made for a war, and that needs to be the subject of loud and long protest. But let me, if I may, just change the subject or sort of revert back to what I was just talking about.
Sure. Sorry. Yeah, I have my own chip on my shoulder here, obviously. Go ahead.
It's an important issue, and I don't want to diminish. But at the same time, we have another equally important issue that is raised by the fundamental geopolitical realities of Afghanistan, and that is the ridiculous notion that the United States military is going to go in there and somehow gain control over this Taliban movement and over Pashtun nationalism or the Pashtun movement against the central government and its Tajik and Hazara allies. The idea is absurd because, as I was just saying, of the size of the territory that is involved here. If the United States should send another 10 or 20,000 troops to Helmand province, Helmand is a huge province. It is roughly, I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, but it's certainly not that far from the size of the effective territory of South Vietnam, in which the United States troops operated during the Vietnam War. It's very comparable to the entire territory of South Vietnam, the effective territory of South Vietnam in which U.S. troops operated.
And Afghanistan as a whole is about the size of Texas, right?
That's correct. My point here is that one of the interesting comparisons between Vietnam and Afghanistan that I've just been making in the last day or two is that, when you actually look at it, most of the territory of South Vietnam was a thin strip of land about 25 to 40 miles wide from the tip of the northern tip of South Vietnam down to the Mekong Delta. It was a tiny strip of land, which U.S. troops and Air Force, even more so, could easily patrol. And it was easy for the United States to essentially destroy the entire area, inhabited area that the Viet Cong controlled, which is exactly what they did. They went in and simply bombed the entire Viet Cong area of central Vietnam, one of the strongest area of Viet Cong political and military control. And then, of course, you had the Mekong Delta, which was somewhat larger. But again, Afghanistan is so much larger than this, and to think that U.S. troops are going to make a dent on this movement in the long run is sheer lunacy. And to his credit, I have no use for the supine position that Obama has taken in relation to the military and sending these troops. But to his credit, he did, in fact, force the military to agree that the military mission was not going to be to defeat the Taliban or to uproot them, but rather to put a dent in them. And I'm quite sure that what Obama is doing here is laying the groundwork for a future negotiated settlement.
Well, see, I wonder about all that. I mean, I guess saw this coming too. That I guess you saw it coming. Explained to me on the show is why I saw it coming. basically compromise where we send in more troops, but we try to define down the goals of the mission to something more limited. And yet, I mean, I don't know, because the speech the other night was so full of contradictions. On one hand, he said, we're going to put 30,000 troops in, and then we're going to start pulling them out again in 18 months.
Right.
And all this. But then on the other hand, he said, as they stand up, we'll stand down, and we're going to build up their military force, and we're going to make the Karzai government the legitimate government of the country, and all this other nonsense.
Right, and as Jon Stewart pointed out, he was basically channeling George Bush in much of this speech.
Yeah.
Let's face it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a Bush-like speech fundamentally. So.
Yeah, Glenn Greenwald had a great write-up of that too, where he actually just took the announcement of the Bush surge in Iraq and transposed all the Bush administration answers with the Barack Obama administration ones, and they're
right.
Just
so
the exact
it
same
was
thing.
really quite poisonous rhetoric. I would say 98% of it, or 99% of it, was quite poisonous.
See, everybody wants to believe in the secret Obama, where you take the best part, and it must be that he's trying to do good. But where's the good?
I think that he is wrongly under the impression that a Democratic president cannot stand up to the military, and that defines his posture. It defines sort of 80 to 85% of his posture, and then he's got another 15 or 20% left in which he feels where he can maneuver, and that's what he's trying to do. I don't think that leaves us with a very bright future at all, and I foresee years and years ahead. I mean, of course, he's probably going to be a one-term president, but in the remainder of his term as president, I see one battle after another between him and the military, in which he's going to, over and over again, have to experience this tension between what he knows to be true and what he feels that he must say and do because of his presumed position of not being able to go directly against the military, that he must make concessions to the military to keep them happy somehow.
Yeah, well, what foolishness. I guess this goes along with what you say about the more powerful you get, the dumber you get, and the more narrow your vision is. Because, of course, how brave would it be for him to stand up to them and say, no, I'm the alpha male around here, and what I say goes, and I say we're getting out of there. How do you like that? People would rally to that if he's actually being a man about it and doing the right thing and staring down his opposition. People, conservatives who are anti-war, would say, yeah, see, there you go.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that the real problem then...
What would Ron Paul do? Yeah. How would Ron Paul vote? That's what he ought to be asking himself. What would Ron say? Ron would say, you know what, generals? You're wrong. I'm the boss, not you. If you don't like it, quit. We're bringing the troops home now. How do you like that? And that'd be the end of that.
Well, I don't think it would be the end of it, but I think that I think you're right, he would rally much greater support, and in the end, he would win. And I think what we're seeing in this pattern of behavior is essentially that the Democratic Party has bred a couple of generations, more than a couple of generations, several generations of political leaders who share this common notion that in order to be a real president, they have to somehow be in line with the national security elite of the country. They in other words, they've internalized the values that lead them down that path. It's not simply a matter of being under pressure, but they have a set of values that they have somehow internalized, which lead them to go along with it, and that's the real problem.
Yeah. Tell me what you know about this guy Jim Jones. I guess he was put there to, help protect Obama. But whose side is he on?
I will tell you what I've heard about Jones. It's something rather contradictory. On one hand, I understand that he has in the past said that he would not take. He'd been offered the position before Obama of CENTCOM commander, but turned it down if it meant that there would be an ongoing U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan. Now, I can't verify that, so, that's sort of raw intelligence. I haven't been able to confirm it. On the other hand, I'm told that he's not the brightest bulb in the collection of Christmas bulbs, and that he does in fact tend to be the kind of personality who will go along rather than put up a strong intellectual argument in the sort of internal intra-administration fights that go on over something like Afghanistan. The interesting question to me is what role he played in the final phase of decision making on Afghanistan this time around. He, of course, was supposed to be helping Obama defend against the McChrystal request for troops, tens of thousands of troops, by articulating an argument that precisely opposed the national security rationale for Afghanistan, by saying that the Taliban really is not like Al-Qaeda, just the message that was leaked by Obama to the New York Times. And he did kind of do that in the interview with CNN in early October. But then when we come down to late October, early November, it begins to look like Jim Jones was part of the cabal that Gates put together of Obama's key national security advisors, who got together and basically united behind the Gates proposal. And I think that had Jim Jones stood up at that point and said, no, I'm not going to abandon the president, it might have been helpful, because a president, the last thing on earth the president wants is to have to face a united set of top national security advisors opposed to him. And so I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that in the end Jones was part of that cabal and went along with the Gates proposal for a 30,000 troop increase.
All right. Well, let me change the subject to something even worse. Iraq. I did an interview with Scott Ritter yesterday. It'll be up on the website. You'll like it. It's a revisionist history of going back and relearning the entire 1990s policy of weapons inspections and pretending Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction of all different descriptions, and the policy of keeping Scott Ritter and his colleagues from proving the negative in Iraq so that they would have the issue for regime change later, and the lies that led to war and all kinds of great things. But one of the things he said at the end, which unfortunately we didn't get a chance to get into too much, but he said that the apparent failure of Maliki and the Iraqi parliament to work out an election law, and I guess this is tied up with the dispute over who controls Kirkuk, that this means that the surge didn't work just like we told you, the benchmarks weren't made just like we told you, and the temporary solution is now going to fall apart, and Iraq will very likely descend back into, it's obviously there's terrible violence every single day there, as anyone who reads antiwar.com knows, but, that this could turn back into a full-scale battle between different militias and all that kind of thing, like the worst of days of 2006 and 2007 again, and then that means that the whole game for the SOFA/Obama plan for withdrawal from Iraq is basically off, as I guess could have been predicted by the cynics among us. But do you think that that's really right? What's going on there, Gareth?
Well, I don't know in terms of inside information at all what's going to happen there. But what my basic sort of analytical constructs have been. That I do in fact believe that al-Maliki has an interest in seeing the SOFA carried out, as of course does Iran. No question about that. This is a fundamental point of common interest between Maliki as a Shia nationalist on one hand, Iraqi Shia nationalist on one hand, and Iran's Shia regime on the other, that they do not want to give the United States an excuse for sort of a semi-permanent occupation of the country by any means, and so I don't assume that a hiccup, if you will, in the plan for carrying out the SOFA, which is a delay in this election, is in fact going to have that effect. I could be wrong, but I mean that I'm basing this on sort of a deeper analysis of the interests of the key parties here.
Right. Well, I know you're in agreement with Patrick Coburn about this too, which is that Maliki succeeded in positioning himself to where basically he has to throw us out or he can't be prime minister anymore. His allies made their deal to be his allies based on the promise that he really means it about kicking us out.
I think that's correct. I think that's precisely right.
And that's how he got the status of forces agreement that he got, that actually has a total withdrawal and not 58 bases in it.
That's true. I mean, of course, that was never going to happen. I mean, that was a...
What about the guys in the Pentagon? Do they remember, and I think you reported this at the time, you covered this, and I went back and found the link, NBC, just before Obama gave his Camp Lejeune speech in February announcing the withdrawal from Iraq, Jim Miklaszewski, NBC News, said, well, I don't know what the president's talking about, but I'm reporting live here from the Pentagon where it's official. We're staying for 50 years.
Yeah, of course, that's what the Bush administration had in mind, no question about it. That was their plan. They were going to be staying there nicely ensconced with an official long-term agreement with Iraq sort of to give them legal cover.
Well, I mean, this was after Bush signed the agreement. This was minutes before Obama went live to say, I am continuing the Bush policy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I do not know who he was talking to at that moment, but I mean certainly it would reflect at that point the ideas of the Odiernos and Petraeuses of the world who still they were upset with Bush's what they thought was a cave-in to the Iranians and to al-Maliki. They thought Bush should have been tougher. At least that's the message that came out of Nancy Youssef in October of 2007. But that I was thinking back to the time when there was a lot of talk about not just from Miklaszewski but from the Bush administration, from Gates and others in the administration, including Bush himself, talking citing South Korea as the model and all that sort of thing. And, I'm quite sure that al-Maliki mousetrapped the Bush administration into this process by letting them think that that's what would be the result. Al-Maliki clearly knew all along he was never going to give them that kind of a deal, but he didn't say so until he was in a position to lock Bush in, and that was when he had Obama as the Democratic candidate for president, who was taking a position that was even beyond what al-Maliki had called for, and which, therefore, Bush had a reason for wanting to reach agreement with al-Maliki.
Right. Yeah, well, looks like he really pulled it off. I talked with a reporter named Michael Hastings. I don't know if you know him.
No.
But he was a reporter in Iraq for quite a while and wrote a book about it. And he's, I guess, a freelance guy, writes for GQ, different things. And I put that question to him, and he said he didn't want to say Maliki was a genius necessarily, but he sure pulled off a pretty magnificent political move here. As far as, the political game is played, he really set the chessboard up just right for himself.
I think he did pretty well, but of course it's in the context where, he was dealing with a government, i.e. the George W. Bush administration and the U.S. military, who were quite clueless about understanding the nuances and complexities of dealing with a Shia Arab regime and a... Oh,
Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani? He's just a minor cleric. Don't worry about him.
Right. The fact is that even the smartest of the lot, and I consider Petraeus to be smarter than the average military type and smarter than most of the people in the Bush administration, was really over his head in Iraq in the context of the al-Maliki regime and the complexities of Shia politics in Iraq particularly.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, now let me ask you about Iran.
Sure.
As we all know, as again discussed with Scott Ritter on the show yesterday, the American people hear the word nuclear, and if the government says that means weapons, danger, then that's good enough for them, because after all, nuclear technology is complicated, and who wants to bother, being a citizen?
The bell rings and we all salivate, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, after all, I gotta admit, if I didn't just have Dr. Prather's articles at my fingertips to understand all these nuclear matters and this and that and the difference between this and that, it'd be pretty difficult for me to, I don't know whether I would have delved into trying to figure out all this IAEA stuff myself. I mean, I would have had you, but, I've learned a lot from Dr. Prather, and so I'm just lucky that way. Most people aren't lucky that way to understand the differences between this and that and all the, he was also an advisor to senators, so he explains the ins and outs of the treaties and how they work so well with the safeguards agreements and all that stuff, and really takes a lot of the kind of trust us, out of the narrative, where you don't have to trust them at all. Here's all the facts, and they're plain as day, and they completely contradict what the war party says. Anybody who reads Prather knows that. Anybody who doesn't know that. And this is a real problem, and especially when TV's reporting, hey, they're going to make 10 new uranium sites. It's a nuclear bomb. We're going to die. Does that mean that, are we really still on the path to war with Iran, Gareth, based on this ridiculous nonsense?
Possibly, yes. Yes, I think it's still a possibility. I would put the odds at, not far from 50-50 at this point. I mean, that's being pessimistic, but I think it's pessimism that is not unwarranted because of the politics in this country being stacked so strongly in favor of confrontation with Iran. And again, you have the same problem of a Democratic president who is afraid to stand up to those people who are urging that confrontation on him. And I think that's why we had a really stupid diplomatic posture going into the talks with Iran, of demanding something that, I have to admit, in retrospect, I didn't look at carefully enough, early enough, in terms of its political implications for the Iranians. But as I finally pointed out, in the latter stage of this, the Iranians recognized that what was going on was that Gary Seymour, the advisor to Obama on WMD, was coming up with this idea of, let's demand that the Iranians give up their entire low-enriched uranium stockpile for like most of a year, so that we can crow to the Israelis. Look what we did. See, we're able to control the Iranians. We don't need you, and we can get by because we're so clever. That ultimately did not pass the laugh test in Tehran, and interestingly, despite the fact that supposedly diplomacy for the right wing was supposed to have the purpose of dividing the Iranian political elite, it had exactly the opposite effect, because everybody from Ali Larijani, the very conservative national security advisor and nuclear negotiator under Khatami, and the early period of Ahmadinejad, to Mousavi, the Green Movement candidate against Ahmadinejad, were saying no to this so-called El Baradei proposal. And in the end, we managed to unite the Iranian elite behind the rejection of that proposal. And it's quite interesting that in the end, Ahmadinejad comes out of this, I think, certainly less weakened than he was before, and arguably stronger in terms of his relationship to the West.
Okay, let me see if I understand this right, and then you correct me where I'm wrong, and then with my conclusions and all that stuff too. And thanks for your patience. Basically, the U.S. offer to the Iranians was, let's work out a deal where you'll export your low-enriched 3.5% uranium to Russia. They'll enrich it up to 20%, which is technically highly enriched uranium, but is, again, way, way, way below weapons grade, which means above 90% uranium. And then they would send it to France to turn it into fuel rods, and then the French would send it back to Iran, and they would use it in their medical reactor, which would be the only one in the world at the time, since the Canadian one is closing down.
Right.
And the Iranians clearly need it and want it and have an entire medical facility ready to go for it. Now, the Iranians are saying, look, man, you guys, if we do this, you could keep all our uranium in France and just tell us, ha, we got your uranium. And so we're not going to let you do that. But I'll tell you what we'll do, and I believe this was the Turkish deal, was we'll put Turkey in there somewhere. I forget exactly where in the chain. But anyway, they would be one of the guarantors of the deal. And the Iranians would actually go ahead and get the fuel rods from France at the same time that they were sending out what they had to the Russians. That way they weren't losing anything.
That's
and so if my understanding of this is right, it seems to me that this is a win for Barack Obama. It's a win for the Iranians. It's a win for the Europeans and the Russians. And I'm not even certain why it would still be a problem for the Israelis.
Just one other point though about the Iranian counter proposal, and that is that it was not to be done in one single transaction. There were to be at least two. There were to be two transactions. So it was never going to be like 75 to 80. I think it was 77 or 78%. Maybe it was 80%. I'm sorry, it was 80%, I guess, of the low enriched uranium supplies that they had accumulated were going to go out all at once. And so the Iranian counterproposal was going to, be such that would not be the case. And I think that symbolically was important to Iran because they would not be in the position then of basically giving up their bargaining chips. And that was explicitly the way it was presented by one of the key political figures in Tehran when he opposed the al-Baradei proposal. He was saying, "Look, I mean, we're really giving up our bargaining chips in one fell swoop here. That doesn't make sense." And I think in the end, that's what made it impossible for Iran, or not impossible, but it made it just a bad bet for Iran to agree to this. They understood that it was not going to have the effect of having everybody go lovey-dovey in the West with regard to Iran and say, okay, now that you've proven yourselves to be true to not being having the ambition to be a nuclear weapons power, we're going to now make a deal that will end the hostility toward Iran. That wasn't going to happen. They understood that. It was simply giving it up and then facing the same kinds of pressures later on, and it didn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me, and maybe I have this wrong, but it seems like the Iranians could simply configure their centrifuges that they already have running at Natanz within their safeguards agreement and enrich their uranium up to 20-something%, technically high grade, but again, way lower than the 90% required to make weapons. But they're not doing that. They're saying, look, we have no desire to configure our centrifuges to anything above 3.5 or 6% because we know that then you'll drop hydrogen bombs on us, for crying out loud. We got our hands up, y'all. We're willing to work with you, but you won't work with us. That's what it looks like to me.
That is correct. I mean, they do in fact have the capacity to do that. They have foregone that by basically either offering to buy it. That's their first choice, of course, is to buy it on commercial terms, and that was refused by the international community. And then the second one was to do some sort of a deal which would leave them whole in the sense of not leaving them at the mercy of people who they do not particularly trust. And they have not gone ahead with their doing it unilaterally, but they've also made it clear that in the end that's still an option. These are very tough negotiators, and they will use whatever leverage they can use, and that's one of the things that they have as leverage, obviously, or at least from their point of view.
And so it goes. All right.
Just one more thing about the 10 about the 10 notional enrichment facilities that are in the news in the last week or so.
Right.
I interviewed the Iranian ambassador a week or so ago. It was just for 20 minutes or so, and he made the point that the Iranians, anytime something is absolutely demanded of them, as it was in the case of the IAEA resolution, saying no more enrichment, and you must stop the construction of the now they call it the Fordow facility. The Iranians' response is going to be a loud no, he said. Anytime you use the language of must, end quotes, he said the answer is going to be a loud no. And that's exactly what this statement about 10 new enrichment plants is. It's simply a symbolic statement of resistance, a loud no to the demand of the IAEA government.
Was that really smart, or are they just proving John Bolton right in that sense?
I think that they're perfectly capable of reacting with anger and not with more anger than good sense. And I think this is a good illustration of that.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where what are you going to do? You're going to bow to the empire or else. So which do you choose?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we can say about the Iranians is that they do not bow well.
Yeah. All right. Well, at least we haven't bombed them yet. That's the good news.
Well, we still have some time, but in my view, it's a matter of some months before we will face some sort of crisis on this.
All right. Well, we'll keep having you back every week to keep us up to date on what's happening between now and then, Gareth.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
Hey, thank you. Everybody, that's Gareth Porter, independent historian and journalist from IPS News, ipsnews.net, and also antiwar.com/Porter.